Right now, an entire town in southern Italy is slowly sliding toward the Mediterranean Sea. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, physically. More than 4 kilometers of hillside have already collapsed. Entire blocks of land have detached from the plateau and dropped away. Homes now hang suspended over a sheer precipice, their foundations exposed to open air. Cars remain frozen in place, dangling from broken garages like discarded toys. And beneath the feet of nearly 25,000 people, the ground is still moving. This is not a sudden catastrophe. It is the latest chapter in a disaster that has been repeating itself for more than 2 centuries. The town is Nimi, located in southern Sicily, just inland from the coastal city of Gela. From a distance, the setting appears tranquil. Terracotta rooftops cluster along narrow streets. Olive groves stretch across rolling hills. The Mediterranean glimmers calmly on the horizon. To the untrained eye, nothing looks wrong. But the ground beneath Nimi tells a very different story. Recent drone footage reveals a deep, jagged scar cutting across the western edge of the town. Streets that once carried traffic now end abruptly at empty space. Homes that stood for generations have vanished, leaving behind broken walls and exposed interiors. Below the cliff lies a chaotic field of debris, crushed concrete, twisted metal, shattered foundations. The collapse zone now stretches more than 4 kilometers across the hillside. In some locations, the land has dropped between 20 and 25 meters in a single event. Italian civil protection authorities have declared a red zone extending 150 meters from the edge, but even that boundary is unstable. The ground continues to shift, forcing officials to repeatedly redraw evacuation lines. This was never supposed to happen again. After a major landslide in 1997, authorities promised comprehensive solutions. Drainage systems would be installed to control water infiltration. Stabilization projects would reinforce the slope. Scientific studies would guide future construction. The disaster, they said, would not be repeated. Those promises quietly dissolved. Projects stalled, funding was delayed, political responsibility was disputed. Over time, memory faded. Life returned to normal. Construction continued. Homes were repaired or rebuilt. New structures appeared on terrain that had already proven unstable. Now history has returned, larger, faster, and far more destructive. What makes Nimi's situation especially disturbing is how long the warning signs have existed. In March of 1790, more than 200 years ago, residents reported a terrifying geological event on the same hillside. Contemporary witnesses described the sudden opening of massive cracks in the earth, deep enough to swallow sections of land. The ground reportedly moved for 8 consecutive days. A naturalist named Saverio Landolina Nava traveled to the area shortly afterward to document what had occurred. His detailed account, published in 1792, describes immense fissures tearing through the terrain. He wrote of entire sections of earth shifting as if driven by an internal force. Stable ground transformed into slanted plains. Vapors rose from the cracks, carrying what observers described as sulfurous odors. At the time, many compared the phenomenon to volcanic activity. Modern geologists reading Landolina Nava's report recognize something chilling. The patterns he described in 1790 mirror what is happening today. The same types of fissures, the same slow but relentless movement, the same destabilization of land once considered solid. The message was clear even then. This terrain was fundamentally unstable, but the warning went unheeded. To understand why Nimi keeps failing, we have to look beneath the surface. The hill on which the town sits is composed of alternating layers of sandstone and clay. Under dry conditions, this combination can appear stable, but when water enters the system, everything changes. Sandstone allows rainwater to penetrate deep into the hillside. Beneath it, thick clay layers absorb that water and begin to swell. As the clay saturates, it loses strength. What was once solid ground slowly transforms into a moving mass, part soil, part mud. According to Italy's Institute for Environmental Protection and Research, the western and southwestern slopes of Nimi fall into the highest possible landslide risk categories. On a 4-level scale, they are classified as S3 and S4 zones, areas with very high susceptibility to slope failure. Urban development only made matters worse. As the town expanded, water runoff from streets, rooftops, and drainage systems carved erosion channels into the hillside. Each channel weakened the slope further. Every new building added weight to terrain already close to its structural limits. The conditions for disaster were always present. All that was needed was a trigger. That trigger arrived once before, in October 1997. After days of heavy rain, residents began hearing strange sounds inside their homes. Creaking walls, shifting floors, faint cracking noises that grew louder by the hour. Some described the ground beneath their feet rising and falling like waves. Trees uprooted without warning. Cracks spread across walls and ceilings in a matter of hours. Nearly 400 residents were forced to flee. Miraculously, no one died, but the psychological impact lingered. The town had been shown unmistakably that the land beneath it could move. In the aftermath, officials promised action. Drainage systems would divert water, engineering projects would anchor the hillside. The science, they said, would guide the future. But as years passed, those plans remained incomplete. Construction resumed, risk zones blurred, memory faded again. By 2026, Nimi was carrying more weight on weaker ground than ever before. The next collapse was no longer a question of if, only when. And when it came, it arrived with a storm unlike anything the region had seen in decades. The trigger arrived in mid-January 2026. Meteorologists had been tracking the system for days, but few expected what it would become. Cyclone Harry formed over unusually warm Mediterranean waters, drawing energy as it moved east towards southern Italy. By the time it reached Sicily, it carried hurricane-force winds and a level of rainfall rarely recorded in the region. Between January 18th and January 21st, the storm battered southern Italy relentlessly. Wind speeds exceeded 120 kilometers per hour. Offshore, waves rose to nearly 12 meters, slamming into the Sicilian coastline. But for the town of Nimi, wind and waves were not the greatest threat. Rain was. Weather stations across Calabria recorded up to 570 millimeters of rainfall in just 72 hours. While final measurements for Nimi were still being compiled, regional data indicated precipitation far beyond seasonal norms. The soil absorbed what it could, then it reached saturation. For the hillside beneath Nimi, this was the breaking point. Water poured through the sandstone layers, racing downward until it reached the clay below. The clay swelled, softened, and began to lose cohesion. Friction between layers dropped sharply. Gravity took over. On Sunday, January 25th, the land began to move. At first, the signs were subtle. Hairline cracks appeared along roads and sidewalks. Doors inside homes no longer closed properly. Windows warped in their frames. Then the sounds began, deep, hollow creaks rising from beneath buildings, followed by sharp cracks that echoed through the streets. Residents recognized the warning. For many, the memory of 1997 came rushing back. One of them was Gaetano Ferrer. He was inside his home when the evacuation order arrived. Civil protection alerts warned residents in the western districts to leave immediately. Based on accounts from evacuees, the official warning came only after the ground had already begun shifting. Ferrer had minutes. His two teenage daughters grabbed their phones and chargers. His elderly parents moved slowly, stunned by the sudden urgency. The family shared a single bag as they stepped into the street. Behind them, the edge of their neighborhood was already disappearing. Before leaving, Ferrer locked his front door. It was a small, almost instinctive gesture, an act of hope in a moment where hope had little meaning. His house now sits inside the red zone, one row back from the advancing cliff. Each day, the edge creeps closer. The Ferrer family, like hundreds of others, was directed to a local sports arena that had been converted into an emergency shelter. Rows of cots filled the floor. Volunteers distributed blankets and bottled water. Mobile kitchens arrived to provide hot meals. But no one could answer the question everyone kept asking: when can we go home? The true scale of destruction only became clear from the air. Drone footage released by Italy's Civil Protection Department showed entire buildings torn in half. Rooms were exposed like dollhouses, furniture still visible inside. Foundation walls hung over empty space. In one haunting image, a car remained suspended at the edge of a collapsed garage, its rear wheels hanging over a 20-meter drop. The landslide had not struck once and stopped. It was still moving. Civil Protection Chief Fabio Siciliano arrived on site to assess the damage. His assessment was blunt and unsettling. The entire hill, he said, was collapsing toward the plain below. Houses located along the edge of the landslide could no longer be inhabited. For many families, permanent relocation would be unavoidable. The number of evacuees rose rapidly. Initial reports listed 500 displaced residents. By the following day, the figure passed 1,000. By midweek, more than 1,500 people had been forced from their homes, and the number continued to climb. Each day brought new failures. Sections of ground that appeared stable in the morning collapsed by nightfall. Streets fractured. Retaining walls gave way. The landslide front retreated deeper into the town, consuming additional homes with each surge. Geologists monitoring the site faced an impossible task. They could measure movement, they could map displacement, but they could not predict when it would stop. Luigi D'Angelo, head of emergency management for the Civil Protection Agency, explained the dilemma clearly. Authorities must wait for the rains to cease and for soil moisture to decrease before meaningful intervention could even begin. But the forecast offered little comfort. More rain was coming. Another 20 meters of terrain could collapse, potentially impacting homes that were still considered safe. The red zone could expand again. New evacuations might be necessary at any moment. Scientific assessments confirmed what residents already feared. This event exceeded the 1997 disaster in both scale and severity. The landslide was wider, deeper, and far closer to densely populated areas. Professor Paolo Lardo, an applied geology expert at the University of Catania, issued a stark warning. The landslide front extended for roughly 4 kilometers and directly threatened the houses facing the slope. What was happening now, he said, was a repetition of the past, but with even more dangerous characteristics. The comparison to 1997 offered no reassurance. Infrastructure damage compounded the crisis. 2 provincial roads leading into Nimi were either swallowed by the landslide or blocked by debris. Entire neighborhoods became isolated. All schools were closed indefinitely. Emergency access routes flooded or collapsed, complicating rescue and relief efforts. Engineers and scientists deployed drones and satellite imagery to monitor the hillside in real time. Advanced instruments tracked ground displacement down to the centimeter. Data streamed into predictive models, attempting to anticipate the next failure. But geology does not follow schedules. The land moves when internal stress exceeds resistance. No model can predict the exact moment when gravity will win. The only certainty was this: the hill had not finished collapsing, and the people of Nimi were watching their town disappear in slow motion. As the hillside continued to move, attention turned away from the collapsing ground and toward an uncomfortable question. Why was anyone still living here? The instability of Nimi was not a new discovery. It was not a hidden geological secret revealed only by modern technology. The danger had been documented, classified, and formally acknowledged again and again over centuries. Yet construction continued. The Italian Institute for Environmental Protection and Research had long classified the western and southwestern slopes of Nimi as S3 and S4 zones, the highest categories of landslide susceptibility. In simple terms, this meant that failure was not a possibility, it was an expectation. So why were homes, roads, and public infrastructure still allowed to exist there? Part of the answer lies in slow, incremental change. Landslides in Nimi did not arrive as sudden, single events. They crept. They fractured walls, tilted streets, warped foundations. Damage accumulated gradually, allowing each generation to normalize what should have been seen as a warning. A cracked road was repaired, a leaning wall was reinforced, a damaged house was rebuilt. Each fix made it easier to ignore the deeper problem. Urban expansion worsened the risk. As Nimi grew, new neighborhoods were carved into already unstable slopes. Pavement replaced soil, preventing natural drainage. Rainwater that once dispersed gradually was funneled into concentrated channels that cut into the hillside. According to geologists studying the area, runoff from streets and rooftops carved erosion gullies that weakened the slope from within. Every heavy storm deepened those channels. Every new building added weight to ground already near its limit. The hill was being pushed toward failure by design. After the 1997 landslide, officials vowed to change course. Plans were announced for drainage systems to divert water away from vulnerable slopes. Retaining structures were proposed. Geological studies were commissioned. Public assurances were made. But many of those projects stalled. Some were delayed by funding disputes. Others became entangled in legal challenges. Several never advanced beyond the planning stage. Over time, urgency faded. Political leadership changed. Attention shifted elsewhere. And life in Nimi returned to normal. Construction resumed. New homes appeared near the edges of previous collapse zones. Roads were repaired but not relocated. The land was treated as stable because it had not failed recently. That assumption would prove catastrophic. When Cyclone Harry arrived, it did not create a new problem. It exposed an old one. Regional President Renato Scafani acknowledged that questions about land use decisions were legitimate, but he emphasized that immediate response had to take priority over assigning blame. Investigations, he said, could come later. It was a familiar deflection. Similar responses followed the 1997 disaster. Earlier still, they followed the collapse documented in 1790 by naturalist Landolina Nava. Each time, warnings were recorded. Each time, they were eventually forgotten. History in Nimi does not repeat loudly. It repeats patiently. As the disaster unfolded, national leaders arrived to show solidarity. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni surveyed the damage by helicopter, flying low over the scarred hillside and shattered neighborhoods. She met with local officials and displaced residents, promising swift assistance. The government declared a state of emergency covering Sicily, Calabria, and Sardinia. An initial allocation of €100 million was announced for immediate relief across the affected regions. The figure sounded significant. It was not. Regional authorities now estimate total damage from Cyclone Harry at more than €2 billion. The Nimi landslide alone accounts for a substantial portion of that cost, with destroyed homes, ruined infrastructure, emergency housing, and relocation expenses mounting daily. Compensation remains a sensitive issue. Many residents affected by the 1997 landslide waited years for financial assistance. Some never received full compensation at all. That memory hangs over the current crisis, fueling anxiety and distrust among evacuees. For families sleeping on cots in the sports arena, promises of aid feel distant and uncertain. What they want is clarity. Will their homes be repaired or demolished? Will they be allowed to return or forced to leave forever? No one has answers. Experts caution that rebuilding in the same locations would be reckless. The hill beneath Nimi has demonstrated a pattern of failure spanning centuries. Engineering solutions may slow movement, but they cannot erase the underlying geology. Professor Giuseppe Muto, who oversees water resources for the environmental organization Legambiente in Sicily, offered a blunt assessment. Nimi, he said, is not an anomaly. It is a warning. Communities must change how and where they build. His message is echoed by national data. Italy has recorded more than 684,000 landslides. Nearly 95% of municipalities face some level of hydrogeological risk. More than 1.28 million people live in areas classified as high or very high landslide danger. And the frequency of extreme weather events is increasing. In 2025 alone, Sicily experienced 48 exceptional weather events, including violent storms, floods, and heat waves. The Mediterranean has become a climate hotspot where warming waters fuel stronger storms and heavier rainfall. The land beneath Nimi was unstable long before climate change intensified rainfall, but rising extremes have accelerated a process already in motion. The disaster unfolding now is not solely natural. It is the result of choices layered on top of geology. Where to build, what to ignore, when to act and when not to. As night falls over the evacuation center, the people of Nimi wait. Some scroll through drone footage of their homes online. Others avoid looking altogether. Conversations drift between hope and resignation. Outside, the hillside continues to shift, inch by inch. The ground does not care about borders, budgets, or political timelines. It moves according to physics, and it is not finished yet. There is a moment in every slow disaster when uncertainty becomes permanent. For Nimi, that moment arrived not when the hillside first collapsed, but when experts admitted they could not say when it would stop. Geologists monitoring the landslide now speak in probabilities, not timelines. They track soil saturation, fracture expansion, and ground displacement measured in millimeters per hour. Drones map the terrain daily. Satellites watch from orbit. And still the hillside moves. Luigi D'Angelo, head of emergency management for Italy's Civil Protection Agency, explained the dilemma bluntly. Authorities cannot stabilize the slope while it is actively moving. They must wait for rainfall to decrease and moisture levels to fall before any intervention can even be attempted. But more rain is coming. Forecast models show additional storms tracking across the central Mediterranean. Each rainfall event adds weight to already saturated soil, increasing pore pressure within the clay layers beneath Nimi. Each hour of precipitation pushes the hill closer to another release of energy. The collapse does not behave like an explosion. It behaves like a slow betrayal. Entire sections of terrain that appeared intact at sunrise have fractured by nightfall. Roads that were open in the morning become impassable by evening. Engineers update red zone maps daily, sometimes twice a day. The boundaries keep expanding. Families who believed they were safe find themselves evacuated again, moved farther inland, farther from certainty. The psychological toll is severe. For residents of Nimi, the trauma is not limited to what has already been lost. It is amplified by the knowledge that what remains may disappear next. You cannot rebuild when you do not know where the ground will be tomorrow. Children ask when they can go home. Parents do not know how to answer. Elderly residents, some of whom survived the 1997 landslide, now face displacement for the second or third time in their lives. For many, leaving permanently feels like surrendering their identity, but staying may no longer be an option. Experts increasingly believe that large sections of Nimi will have to be abandoned. Managed retreat, relocating entire neighborhoods away from the unstable slope, is now under serious discussion. It is a word no community wants to hear. Relocation means more than moving houses. It means dismantling social networks, dissolving generational ties to land, rewriting the map of a town that has existed for centuries. And it is expensive. The cost of relocating even a fraction of Nimi's population could reach hundreds of millions of euros. Funding remains uncertain. Political will is fragile. Property values in risk zones have already collapsed, leaving homeowners financially trapped. Insurance coverage is limited or non-existent. Some families will lose everything. Nimi's crisis forces a broader reckoning. Across Italy and much of the world, towns have been built on slopes, cliffs, floodplains, and coastlines under the assumption that past stability guaranteed future safety. Engineering solutions created the illusion of permanence. But geology operates on different terms. Climate change is not creating new risks so much as accelerating old ones. Heavier rainfall, stronger storms, and rising groundwater levels are pushing already unstable systems past their thresholds. What once failed once every century now fails within a lifetime. What once crept now collapses. In Nimi, the land has been warning humans for 236 years. Those warnings were recorded, archived, and ignored. Each generation assumed that catastrophe belonged to the past. Until it didn't. The question now facing authorities is not whether the hillside can be fixed. It is whether people should ever have been allowed to live there at all. That question echoes far beyond Sicily. From California's collapsing cliffs to South America's sliding hillsides, from Himalayan villages to Mediterranean coasts, communities around the world are confronting the same reality. We built in places that were never stable. We stayed because nothing happened, until suddenly everything did. The science cannot offer certainty. No model can predict the exact moment when soil gives way. No instrument can hear the final fracture forming deep underground. All monitoring can do is observe, and warn if anyone is willing to listen. As night falls again over Nimi, the evacuation center grows quieter. Some residents sleep. Others stare at phones, watching live updates, scrolling through images of their own homes at the edge of a cliff that did not exist a week ago. Outside the town, the Mediterranean continues to shimmer, indifferent to what is happening above it. Rain clouds gather offshore. The hillside shifts again, almost imperceptibly. Another centimeter, another crack, another reminder that the ground beneath human civilization is never truly still. Nimi is not the first town to face this reckoning. It will not be the last. The only question is how many warnings we will ignore before we accept that some places are not meant to be permanent. When the earth decides to move, there are no negotiations, only consequences.